Thanks, Karen. I have to read, guys, because I'm a really wild, discursive speaker, so I need to follow a text, because otherwise I'll be here for 45 minutes. So, and I tested this last night, and it was 10 and a half minutes, but I spoke to myself very quickly. So, okay. So Irish holy wells are settings with deep spiritual, cultural, and healing histories, and they also act as markers of a sustained connection between people and place. Speaking as a culturally inspired health geographer, the relationship between affect, bodies, practice and well-being all interest me greatly. In considering these terms, I see them not so much as a reflection of the phenomenologically inspired notion of the sense of place, but rather as a means to explore places of the senses. Masumi, for example, notes that affect is synesthetic, implying a participation of the senses in each other, and I would add, in place as well. The extent to which holy wells as exemplary therapeutic landscapes bring together and make concrete connective threads between the affective, embodied and performative opens the way to consider such empirical settings as therapeutic assemblages. In addition, recent discussions on the therapeutic landscape, and I think Rebecca's work really comments on this brilliantly, has seen them recast as sites of therapeutic potential within which individual experiential responses shape a more relational and less predictable healing benefit. In studying holy wells, a therapeutic assemblage approach suggests the need to consider three dimensions: material spaces, metaphors and symbols, and finally inhabitation. All three themes work together to frame the spaces as sites of mind, body, spirit healing and well-being. There are cross-cutting dimensions as well in this kind of model, but I just want to introduce this template purely to provide a structure to an otherwise babbling brook exploration of holy well spaces. The rest of the talk will simply explore material, metaphorical and inhabited dimensions in turn, but firstly I will briefly introduce a sense of the depth of the wells themselves. For me, holy wells are places where bodies, emotions and rituals are involved in the production of a Carte, Jondo, a type of profound mapping. The term Cante Jondo, from which I freely steal, describes a deeply soulful form of flamenco singing, which I think can be applicable to sensed landscape as well, and was described exquisitely by Lorca in 1931 as follows. The Cante Jondo approaches the rhythm of the birds and the natural music of the black poplar and the waves. It is simple in oldness and style. It is also a rare example of primitive song, the oldest of all Europe, where the ruins of history, the lyrical fragment eaten by the sand, appear live like the first morning of its life. That's Lorca, not me. As spaces, there's lots of images from here on in, as spaces, holy wells are material examples of landscapes with reputational associations with health, even if that health is hard to authenticate. They are also built environments containing a range of forms of constructions, from very rough, shallow pools in the ground to elaborate sites familiar to other pilgrimage settings. They are also inhabited by material bodies in variable states of health, which reflect the reality of the complex life cycle of the healthy and unhealthy body. Yet they are also spaces which not only have varied material geographies, but can also incorporate different spaces, isolated, open to the elements, enclosed and shadowy, hidden and public, lost and found, all with their own distinctive healing potentials. These in turn appeal to different types of individuals and groups who are seeking out spaces of difference and communitas. In considering the holy well as places where bodily health is encountered and sought out, the motivations include traditional uses for relief from a whole range of simple physical complaints. Ordinary chronic illness and cyclical states of health form parts of the narrative, with repeated visits to manage migraines, arthritis, and even cancers. The visit pilgrimage also contributes to a renewal of the physical body, even if that renewal is only temporary or ephemeral, and is a significant but understated element of embodiment at the well. If people want to talk to me about the pictures later on, I'll talk to you about them at that point. In considering health at the holy well, it is also important to think about the metaphors and symbols that shape well identities and meanings. As most studies of wells attest, the settings and surroundings are framed by deeper cultural meanings and can be argued, in landscapes of therapeutic potential terms, as being symbolic spaces of healing, sitting between embodiment and practice. In viewing the holy well as a setting where the senses are engaged and reimagined, there are curative rituals which add deeper symbolic connections to the place. While wells in different countries all over the world have their own metaphors, there is a surprising similarity, not just across the British Isles, but globally, as to how healing water sites are culturally constructed and understood. These images introduce some of the metaphors and cultural signs associated with healing at the Holy Well. The metaphor of the discarded crutch provides a representation of cures at a whole range of watering places and religious sites where the healing is in part physical, but just as often spiritual, even miraculous. In addition, the presence and repeated use of rag trees and bushes are a mix of the embodied, symbolic and performative, wherein an object which should touch the body, such as a strip of cloth from a petticoat, is dipped in the well water, rubbed on the affected part, and left on the tree to let nature take the now disembodied illness away. In addition to bodily health, mental healing is also strongly associated with holy wells, literally in some cases as a tabernaut, one of which translation was named as the Well of the Insane, and indeed some testing at a well site in Kerry identified traces of lithium in the water, which is very interesting in terms of contemporary medical practice. But in their wider metaphors as sites of rest, retreat and restoration, always words beginning with R-E. Their deeper potential as safe havens reflects work from wider mental health geographies. Mental health, too, is characterised by its recurrent status, and the annual, seasonal, intermittent and contingent visits to the well reflect that flow. In invoking the notion of energies and renewal, the rechargings that take place at the well were and are as much mental as physical. Finally, what really characterises the wells are the rituals and practices associated with them. The rounding rituals, or turas in Irish, as well as annual pilgrimage seasons and pattern days celebrating the patron saint's birthday, are all essentially performative and indeed very productive forms of performance at that. It is in these practices associated with the pilgrimages to the Holy Well that the true relational health emerges, expressed through a range of imbrications in place. Incidentally, and in line with David Conradson's contested take, there were many examples of unhealthy practices at the wells too, as pattern days in particular descended into less healthy and much more liminal performances of drink, violence and even sex. Things are much tamer nowadays, unfortunately, but the old practices and the narratives sustain in many places. Yet new practices and performances also emerge from different users, such as the travelling community, who have a particularly strong devotion to holy wells, which relate to life events such as baptisms, protective child health, and even funerary rites. In their manifestation as sites of pilgrimage with a strong affinity to a sacred patron, the sites also represent settings in which a form of spiritual/soul health is encountered. While many of the more communal performances are framed by Catholic faith and its practice, these are, as we've noted, sites which are open to much freer and more informal spiritualities as well. There are occasional clashes here, but New Age adherents, Wicca and various other sort of New Age spiritualities also worship at the well in unique ways of their own, and in general there is a coexistence of reverence. The relationship to spiritual power and energy was and is also a feature of such settings where the power of the well is at its height around pattern days, usually at midnight on the eve of pattern day, and or pilgrimage season, and has a reduced energy. It's still powerful, but its energy is slightly reduced at other times of the year. So this notion of a mobile energy in spiritual place produces differential powers of healing and renewal. I thought, as we're also something to do with art, I'll chuck some of this in as well, but I think it's interesting. At the same time, this is the art part of cartography, by the way. At the same time, the Holy Well has continued to inspire a multiple set of representations of its own. These representations have inspired a range of artists using different mediums: poetry, theatre, photography, painting and calligraphy, to develop a deeper creative depth of engagement and arte Jondo even with the Holy Well. Examples presented here from a visual perspective include paintings by William Orpin and Lillian Davidson and a photograph from an exhibition by Abigail O'Brien. While the lurid imagery of Orpin's work has its detractors, what can be seen from all of the images is the role of colour, nature and bodies in making well settings an almost irresistible draw for the artist. A form of engagement which I think emerges from the landscape to promote an effective and creative response. As a second set of representations, the role of the text, and indeed what is known in increasingly called in medical humanities narrative-based medicine, thank God for that, attests to the relationships between discourses and the differential representations of health and place. Examples here include material from the National Folklore Collection from the 1930s, which incorporates sketches and documentary evidence on cures and practices. But there are also representations of calligraphy as art, as evidence in what I think is the seriously under-regarded but exquisite traditional Irish script. The third image is a postcard from what one might term a Roman nationalised shrine dedicated to St. Bridget at Foghart in County Louth. Here, the newly approved and church-stamped site, opened by Éamon de Valera in a very big ceremony in the 1930s, lies in contrast to its sister site, half a mile up the road, which bears the spectral traces of an older and more pagan inhabitation of rags, charms and spells. That's the last slide. So this one is dynamic, but I'll keep pressing it. It does, and it should be slower than that. I'm blaming the Mac. So. Finally, the capacity of the wells to function as therapeutic landscapes sets off a discussion on energies and the curative power of the sites themselves. So I've lost it there.
I'll go ahead and do that while you read.
Okay.
You want to just finish reading?
This is the last slide. Okay, that's fine. So finally, the capacity of the wells to function as therapeutic landscape sets off discussion on energies and the curative power of the sites themselves. Each well has a mobile energy, sustained in stories and left objects alike, which speak to a transformative role as site of stillness and retreat, but also to very specific new meanings, epigenetically produced by generations of visitors in recent decades of memorial anxiety, grief and loss. Framing a holy well like St. Kieran's as a therapeutic assemblage tallies with the holistic description of its position as a Carte humbug. One can see a piece of micro-landscape of healing and wellness which bears material objects in a rolling topography of wells, trees, rocks, oratories and crosses. One can also see as a second layer on top of that the complex culturally produced meanings embedded in and shaping those material objects, the identities, especially the health identities invested in them, and the hue and shade of metaphor on the material. Finally, one can see a third layer of people, not ghostly, but solid palimpsestic traces of embodied human occupation and the uses and meanings and constructions that those mobile inhabitations enact on the site. In the soundscapes of the well, nature, as well as the traditional Cante Jondo of Ireland, Sean knows, at times provides a form of textual trace. But it is in the imagery and material objects of the well that the true almost oicha, the honouring of place, emerges and endures.